When my son married, I never told a soul that I was quietly worth $72 million. I kept it locked away where no one could see it, and I went on living in the same small house and driving the same rusted truck I had owned for 20 years. It was the wisest thing I ever did, because 1 week to the day after the wedding, my son's new bride appeared on my porch without warning, a polished corporate attorney standing at her shoulder, and she informed me that it was time I signed my future over to her. She looked at my worn boots and my thin gray hair and decided she had cornered a harmless old man. She had no idea that my late wife, from beyond the grave, had already set a trap that greed itself would spring. Before I tell you how it all unraveled, do me a kindness. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what town you were watching from tonight. It lifts an old man's heart to know how far these stories reach. Now let me begin at the beginning. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. My name is Everett Lyle. I am 71 years old, and for most of my working life, I was a pharmacist. I started behind a single counter in a small drugstore, counting pills and learning the names of every family in town. And over the years, that one store became a chain of 11 across 3 counties. I knew which children had asthma and which grandmothers could not afford their heart medicine. And more than once, I quietly covered a prescription for someone who could not, because my late wife, Marion, taught me that a pharmacy is not really in the business of selling pills. It is in the business of keeping people alive. Behind that counter, I learned to read the whole of a person from very little. A man would come in for something small, an ointment, a bottle of aspirin, and linger a moment too long. And I would know before he said a word that the real trouble was not on his prescription. I learned which silences meant grief and which meant shame, which questions were about medicine and which were about money too small to admit out loud. 40 years of that, of watching people at their most frightened and most human, teaches you a kind of quiet arithmetic of the heart. You learn who is telling the truth and who is performing it. You learn that the loudest complaint is rarely the deepest wound. And you learn, above all, to wait and to watch and to let people show you who they are before you decide how to help them. That patience was the only real skill I ever had. It would turn out to be the only one I needed. That lesson shaped everything that came after, including the strange and painful year I am about to describe to you. I met Marion in my second year behind that counter. She came in with a prescription for her mother and a list of questions that no one had ever bothered to answer for her. And I spent 40 minutes explaining every pill and every interaction until the line behind her stretched to the door. She came back the next week with another list, and the week after that with no list at all. And within a year, we were married. People assume a pharmacist marries a nurse or a doctor, someone from the same world of medicine. Marion was nothing of the sort. She was a bookkeeper with a mind like a bank vault, and she saw money the way I saw chemistry, as a system with rules that most people never bothered to learn. For 46 years, we were a strange and perfect pair. My patience with people and her patience with numbers, and everything we built out of that. We had almost nothing in those first years, and I think now they were the best of my life. We lived above the original store in 2 rooms that smelled faintly of liniment, and on Sundays, our only day closed, Marion would spread the week's receipts across the kitchen table and show me, penny by penny, where every dollar had gone and where the next one would go. She made a game of it, And somewhere in that game, I fell more deeply in love with her than I had on the day we married. Other men chased money as though it were a wild thing to be caught. Marion tended it like a garden, patiently, without greed, trusting that small, disciplined things done for long enough become large. She never wanted a bigger house. She never wanted jewels. What she wanted was the quiet security of knowing that no illness, no accident, no cruel turn of fortune could ever put us at the mercy of anyone. And she built exactly that, one careful year at a time. 12 years ago, a national company offered to buy my chain, and after a great deal of thought, I sold it. The sale left me with more money than a small-town pharmacist ever expected to see, and it might have ended there, a comfortable retirement and nothing more. But Marion was the quiet financial genius in our marriage. While I had spent 40 years counting pills, she had spent those same years reading annual reports at the kitchen table, investing our savings with a patience and a discipline that would have shamed men who did it for a living. By the time she passed away 3 years ago, the money from the sale and the fortune she had grown from it sat in a private trust, carefully built and sealed, worth just over $72 million. I want you to understand that neither of us ever set out to be rich. Wealth was not a goal to Marion. It was a byproduct of a discipline she practiced for its own sake. The same way I counted pills carefully, not to get rich, but because a life depended on the count being right. She read the financial pages the way some women read novels, and she made her decisions slowly, over months, never chasing the fashionable thing, never frightened by a bad year. Once, decades ago, I asked her why she did not simply enjoy some of it while we were young, and she looked at me and said that the money was not for us. It was for the moment we could not yet see, the moment when it would be needed to do some good that mattered. I did not understand her then. I understand her completely now. She was building all those years toward a purpose she trusted would reveal itself. And in the end, it did. And almost no one on this earth knew it existed. I want to be honest with you about what that kind of secret does to a man. There is a loneliness in it. When your neighbor complains about his heating bill, you cannot tell him it would not trouble you. When a friend frets about outliving his savings, you must nod along as though you share the fear. I carried the number alone for years, and Marion carried it with me while she lived. And after she was gone, I carried it by myself. And there were nights I resented it, this invisible weight that separated me from the ordinary worries of ordinary men. But I never once considered spending it to make my life softer, because the money was never really about me. It was a seed Marion had grown, and a seed is not meant to be eaten. It is meant to be planted at the right moment in the right ground. I was simply waiting to learn where that ground was. There is a discipline in that kind of waiting that few people ever practice. Every man I have ever known who came into money spent it, or gave it away too fast, or let it be taken, because money in the hand is a loud and restless thing that begs to be used. To hold it quietly, to let it sit and grow and say nothing, requires a patience most people simply do not have. But I had spent 40 years developing exactly that patience, one careful transaction at a time, and Marion had spent 40 years perfecting it. And so we sat on our fortune the way a farmer sits on good seed through a long winter. Not because we were miserly, but because we understood that the value of a seed is entirely in the timing of its planting. Eat it too soon, and you have a single meal. Wait, and plant it right, and you can feed a whole town. I only had to be patient enough to learn which it would be. I never touched it, not for myself. I kept living on my pharmacist's pension and the little house Marion and I bought in 1979, and I drove the same truck with the same dent in the tailgate, and I let the whole world believe I was exactly what I appeared to be, a modest old widower of modest means. I did this on purpose, and I did it for one reason. I have one son, and I wanted him to grow into a man before he ever learned there was a fortune with his name anywhere near it. I had watched inherited money ruin better families than mine. I wanted my boy to build something with his own two hands first, so that if the money ever did reach him, it would land on a man strong enough to hold it. I had seen the alternative too many times, and not only in the newspapers. A regular customer of mine, a good man who ran the hardware store, came into sudden money late in life and gave it freely to his children, and within 5 years, 2 of those children were not speaking to each other, and the third had drunk himself into an early grave. Money, I have come to believe, does not change a person so much as it magnifies whatever was already there. Pour a fortune onto a strong man, and you get a builder. Pour it onto a weak one, and you get a wreck. I saw the softness in Aaron early, and I blame no one for it but myself. When he was a boy, if he fell, I picked him up before he could learn to rise on his own. If he struggled with a thing, I finished it for him, because it hurt me to watch him strain. Marion warned me about it, gently, more than once. She would say, "Everett, you are loving that boy weak." And I would tell her I was only being a good father, and we were both a little right and both a little wrong. A child needs to be caught sometimes, and a child needs to be let fall sometimes. And the great art of raising one is knowing which moment is which. I got the proportion wrong. I caught him too often. And so he grew into a pleasant, likable man who had never in his life had to stand back up on his own, and who therefore had no idea at 38 whether he even could. I did not yet know which kind of man my son would turn out to be, and so I kept the fortune hidden, telling myself I was protecting him, when perhaps I was only postponing the day I would finally find out. My son's name is Aaron, and he is 38. For most of his life, I believed my plan was working. He was not a hard worker exactly, but he got by, and he was pleasant and easy to like, which I came to understand was both his gift and his weakness. Aaron wanted very badly to be liked, and a man who needs the approval of others that much is a man who can be led anywhere by anyone willing to give it to him. For years, the person leading him was no one in particular, and he drifted along harmlessly enough. And then, 2 years ago, he met a woman named Sabrina, and she took the reins of my son so smoothly and so completely that I do not think he ever felt them tighten. I watched it happen over the course of a single year, and it was like watching a slow tide come in. At first, Sabrina was simply the woman Aaron was seeing, and then she was the woman who ordered for him at dinner, and then she was the woman who spoke for him when I asked him a question, and by the end, she was the woman who decided which of my calls he returned and which he did not. None of it was sudden. That is how the skilled ones do it, so gradually that the person being taken over never notices the moment it happened, never feels a single link of the chain close. Aaron did not think he was being controlled. He thought he was being loved, cared for, managed by someone who knew better than he did what was good for him. And in a terrible way, he was not entirely wrong, because Sabrina did know better than he did. She simply knew it in the service of herself, and never once in the service of him. Sabrina was beautiful, sharp, and relentlessly charming, and from the first dinner I could not shake the feeling that I was being appraised rather than met. She asked me a great many warm questions about my life, my house, my finances, all of it wrapped in the softest concern. And I answered every one of them like the poor pensioner I appeared to be. I watched a flicker of disappointment cross her face when I described my pension and my paid-off little house, and I filed that flicker away and said nothing. I have spent a lifetime reading people across a pharmacy counter, watching for the ones who lie about their symptoms to get what they are really after. Sabrina had that same quality. She was performing an illness of affection to obtain a prescription she wanted very badly. And the prescription was my son. You learn to spot it in a pharmacy. The person who comes to the counter with a rehearsed story and eyes that will not quite meet yours, describing a pain that does not match the way they carry their body, asking for the specific thing they have already decided to walk out with. Most of them are not evil. Most are simply in the grip of a need stronger than their honesty. But a few of them are something colder. People who have learned to weaponize sympathy, who study what a decent person wants to hear and then say exactly that, over and over, until they get what they came for. Sabrina was the coldest example of that type I had ever met, and she was standing in my dining room, being charming to my son, and I could see the whole shape of her the way I could once see a forged prescription from across the room. There were small tells all through that year that a less watchful man would have missed. The way she asked, always so lightly, about the value of my little house, as if making conversation, and then went quiet and thoughtful when I named a modest figure. The way her eyes moved across a room and priced everything in it. The way her warmth toward me ran exactly as hot as she believed my usefulness to be, and cooled the moment she decided I was poor. I noticed all of it, and I said nothing, and I let her go on believing she had read me correctly, because a person who thinks they have you figured out will show you far more of themselves than one who is still guessing. She had decided I was a harmless, penniless old man, and every warm and false word she spoke to me after that was spoken in the comfortable belief that I could not possibly matter. That belief was the most useful thing she ever gave me. They married a little over a year after they met, in a ceremony far grander than Aaron could afford, which puzzled me at the time, because I was still under the impression that Sabrina believed there was no family money to speak of. I paid for none of it, and I said nothing about the cost. I stood in the back of that beautiful venue and watched my son promise his life to a woman whose eyes kept drifting all evening toward the exits and the guest list and the value of the room. And I felt a cold weight settle into my chest that I could not quite name. I told myself I was a suspicious old man souring at his son's happiness. I told myself I was wrong about her. I was not wrong about her. I was simply early. I remember one moment from the wedding with a clarity that has never left me. During the reception, I stepped out onto a balcony for some air, and through the glass door I watched Sabrina, believing herself unobserved, drop her bright smile the instant the guest she had been charming turned away. Her whole face changed. The warmth went out of it like a light switched off, and for just a second I saw the cold, calculating machinery underneath, the woman taking inventory of the room she had just married into. Then another guest approached, and the smile snapped back on, radiant and false, and she was the charming bride again. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but I have spent my life watching for exactly that, the face a person wears when they think no one is looking, because that face is the true one. I went back inside and danced with my new daughter-in-law and told her she looked beautiful, and I meant not one word of it. And neither, I am quite sure, did she. I said nothing to Aaron, and I have asked myself many times since whether that was a mistake. Should I have taken my son aside and told him what I saw, warned him that the woman he loved was appraising him like a property listing? But I have watched too many fathers try that, and I have watched it fail every single time. Because a man in love does not hear a warning, he hears an attack, and it only drives him closer to the person he is being warned against. Aaron would not have believed me. He would have decided his suspicious old father was trying to control him, and Sabrina would have used that suspicion to pull him further into her orbit. So I held my tongue, and I watched, and I trusted that the truth about a person like Sabrina always surfaces on its own, given a little time. It surfaced in 7 days. I have thought many times about how quickly it came. Not 7 months, not 7 weeks, 7 days. She did not even wait for the wedding photographs to be printed. That, more than anything, told me the whole truth of the thing. A woman who truly believed she had married into an ordinary family, a family of modest means, would have settled into the marriage, made a life, waited years before any question of money ever arose, if it arose at all. Sabrina came for the fortune before the flowers from the ceremony had wilted, and she came with a lawyer and a document already drafted, which meant she had begun preparing the assault before she ever said her vows. The wedding, I understood then, had not been a beginning. It had been a key being cut. She had married my son on a Saturday and come to rob his father the following Tuesday. And the speed of it was not carelessness. It was appetite. She simply could not wait. Exactly 7 days after the wedding, on a quiet Tuesday morning, there was a knock at my front door. And when I opened it, Sabrina was standing on my porch in an expensive gray suit, and beside her stood a man I had never seen, carrying a leather briefcase and the practiced smile of an attorney who bills by the minute. Sabrina's warmth was gone. In its place was something brisk and businesslike, the tone of a woman who has decided the pleasantries are no longer necessary. "Everett," she said, "not Dad, never Dad. We need to talk about the family's finances. May we come in?" And I understood in that single instant that somewhere in the 7 days since the wedding, my daughter-in-law had learned the one thing I had spent 12 years keeping hidden. It is a strange feeling to have your deepest secret suddenly known by the wrong person. For 12 years, the money had been a quiet, private thing, a matter between me and Marion and a locked trust. To have that privacy suddenly stripped away, to see my own carefully guarded secret glittering in the eyes of a stranger on my porch, felt like being robbed before a single dollar had changed hands. For 12 years, the fortune had been mine to guard, a thing I controlled by keeping it invisible. And in the space of 1 week, a careless banker and a greedy woman had taken that control from me. I felt exposed in a way I had not felt since I was a young man with empty pockets. And underneath the exposure, colder and clearer, came the understanding that the invisibility that had protected me for so long was gone and would not come back, and that I would now have to protect the fortune some other way. The old defense had failed. I would need a new one. And though I did not yet say it out loud, even to myself, I already knew that Marion, 3 years in her grave, had built that new defense for me long before I ever knew I would need it. And now, here it was, reflected back at me in the hard, hungry eyes of a woman I barely knew. And I could see in an instant that she did not see a family or a father-in-law or even a person. She saw a combination lock, and she had come to force it open. I felt, standing in my own doorway, a curious calm settle over me. The same calm I used to feel when a difficult prescription came across my counter, one with a dangerous interaction hidden inside it. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was zero, which meant it was no time for panic. It was time to be very, very careful. I found out later how she learned it. A young man who worked at the private bank that administered a small part of the trust had been charmed by Sabrina at a party, and over drinks he had let slip, trying to impress her, that the quiet old man in the paid-off house was in fact one of the bank's largest private clients. I did not blame the young man, not really. He was foolish and vain and wanted to impress a beautiful woman. And he paid for it later, I am told, with his job. But I have thought about that single loose sentence many times, about how a fortune Marion and I guarded in silence for 12 years was undone by one man's need to feel important for the length of a cocktail. That is how most secrets die, not through cleverness or investigation, but through vanity, through someone's small hunger to be the person who knows the interesting thing. Sabrina understood that hunger and knew how to feed it. She had a gift for making a man feel, for a few flattered minutes, like the most fascinating person in the room. And men will trade almost anything for that feeling, including things that are not theirs to trade. She spent an evening making a lonely bank clerk feel important, and he handed her the key to my life in return. It was, I must admit, efficiently done. That was all it took. A single loose word, and my daughter-in-law's entire performance dropped away to reveal the campaign underneath it. She had not married my son for love, and possibly not even for comfort. She had married him because she believed he was the key to a locked room full of money. And now, 7 days into that marriage, she had come to demand the key from the old man guarding the door. I did not slam the door. I have learned that you never learn anything from a door that is closed. Instead, I stepped back, and I smiled the vague, slightly confused smile of a tired old man, and I invited them into my small living room and offered them coffee they did not want. I let Sabrina and her lawyer settle onto my worn sofa, and I lowered myself into my chair, and I asked them, mildly, what all this was about. And then I did the thing I have always done best. I went quiet, and I listened, and I let the people across from me tell me exactly who they were, because in my experience, the greedy cannot help themselves. Given a silent audience and the scent of money, they will always, always say too much. It is the oldest tool I have, and the most reliable, and it costs nothing but the discipline to keep your own mouth shut. Most people, faced with a threat, feel a powerful urge to argue, to defend themselves, to explain. That urge is almost always a mistake, because every word you say teaches your opponent how you think and where you are weak. The stronger move, nearly always, is silence. Let the other person fill it. Let them talk until they have told you their whole plan, until they have shown you every card in their hand, believing the whole time that your quiet means agreement or fear. I learned the power of silence behind a pharmacy counter, watching people fill it. A worried mother would come in, and I would ask one gentle question and then simply wait. And in the waiting, she would tell me things she had not planned to say, the real fear beneath the small complaint. Silence is a pressure. Most people cannot bear it and rush to fill it, and in the filling, they reveal themselves. The skilled interrogators know this. The best salesmen know this. And a tired old pharmacist who has spent 40 years letting frightened people talk knows it better than any of them. So when Sabrina and her lawyer sat across from me expecting an argument and found instead only a soft, nodding silence, They did exactly what people always do. They filled it. They talked and explained and reassured, and in doing so, they laid out their entire scheme in front of a man they believed was too dim to follow it. I did not need to pry a single thing out of them. I only needed to be quiet and let them hang themselves with their own eager mouths. Sabrina and her lawyer had come to my house expecting resistance, and when they found only a soft, nodding, silent old man, they relaxed. And they grew bold, and they told me things they should have taken to their graves. The lawyer did the talking at first, in the smooth, reassuring voice they teach in expensive schools. He explained that Sabrina and Aaron had become concerned for my well-being, that a man of my age, living alone, managing significant assets, was vulnerable, and that the loving thing, the responsible thing, would be to consolidate those assets under a family financial management agreement. He slid a thick document across my coffee table. It would, he explained, simply allow Aaron and Sabrina to help me manage my affairs, to protect me from scams and mistakes, to give me peace in my later years. He said the word peace 3 times. That was the tell that gave the whole game away, if either of them had been watching me closely enough to notice it. When a man says a word 3 times in as many minutes, that word is a lie he is trying to sell. Honest people do not need to repeat themselves. They say a true thing once and let it stand. But a man selling you a poison dressed as medicine will keep pressing the label, peace, 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 because he is afraid that if he stops talking for even a moment, you will taste what is really in the cup. I had heard that particular music my whole career, from salesmen pushing pills that did more harm than good, and I knew it the instant this smooth young lawyer began to sing it. He was not offering me peace. He was offering me a surrender wrapped in the word peace, and he was repeating the word precisely because some part of him knew it was a lie. I let him keep singing. It was useful to hear the whole song, and I sat there nodding gently, reading upside down, which is a skill you develop after 40 years of watching people sign things across a counter. And I saw exactly what that document truly was. It was not a management agreement. It was a surrender. Buried in the soft language was a transfer of control over the trust, granting Sabrina and my son joint authority over every dollar, with Sabrina named as the primary agent. In plain terms, it would hand my life's fortune, and Marion's, to the very woman who had married into my family 7 days earlier for exactly this purpose. If I signed it, I would be a guest in my own financial life, dependent on the goodwill of a person who had none. I looked up from the page, and I let my hand tremble slightly as I set it down. And I told them, in a soft and uncertain voice, that it was all a great deal to take in, and that I would need a few days to think. Sabrina's smile was patient and pitying. She thought she had already won. That was, in the end, her fatal error. And it is the same error that greed always makes. It cannot imagine that the person it is robbing might be smarter than it is. Sabrina had built her entire life on the assumption that she was the cleverest person in any room. And that assumption had served her well, because most rooms she walked into, she probably was. But it made her blind. It never once occurred to her that the trembling old pharmacist across the coffee table had spent 4 decades reading people far more desperate and far more skilled than she was. Or that his late wife had been a financial mind sharper than any lawyer Sabrina could hire. She saw my worn slippers and my shaking hand and my confused questions, and she filed me under harmless, and she stopped watching me the way a hunter stops watching prey it believes is already dead. That is precisely when the prey, if it has any sense, begins to move. Over the next 2 weeks, they came back 3 more times, and each visit, believing I was a confused old man slowly being worn down, they revealed a little more of themselves. On the second visit, Sabrina brought a folder of what she called simple paperwork and grew visibly annoyed when I asked to read it slowly. She tapped her expensive shoe against my worn floor and sighed and exchanged glances with her lawyer, and I watched her patience with the harmless old man fray at the edges. And I understood that patience had never been real, only a costume she wore for as long as she believed it was working. On the third visit, she stopped pretending to care about my well-being at all and spoke to me the way one speaks to a slow child, loudly and simply, and she let a note of contempt creep into her voice that she would never have allowed herself in the beginning. Each time they came, the mask slipped a little further, and each time I encouraged the slipping, playing more confused, more frightened, more nearly beaten, because the more certain they became of their victory, the more freely they showed me the truth of themselves. I was not wearing them down. I was drawing them out. I encouraged it. I asked them frightened, foolish questions, and in answering them, Sabrina grew careless and honest in the way people do around someone they have decided does not matter. She spoke about the money as though it were already hers. She spoke about Aaron on one visit as though he were a tool she had used and would soon set aside, mentioning to her lawyer, when she thought I had left the room, that once the trust was secured, she would not need to stay married to that boring man for long. And I stood in my own hallway, out of sight, listening to my daughter-in-law describe the disposal of my son. And I made a decision. I let my phone, sitting on the hall table, quietly record every word. I need you to understand what it cost me to do that. To stand in the hallway of my own home, out of sight, and listen to the woman my son had married describe him as a boring inconvenience she would discard once the money was secure, and to hold my hand steady over that phone instead of walking into the room and throwing them both out into the street. Every instinct I had as a father screamed to defend my son, to storm in and end it. But I had learned, long ago, that the loud, satisfying response is almost never the effective one. If I had confronted them that day, I would have had my dignity and nothing else. They would have simply gone away and come back with a cleverer scheme, and next time I might not see it coming. So I swallowed my rage, and I let the recording run, and I gathered the proof that would end this not for a day, but forever. Sometimes love looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like a man in a hallway, saying nothing, recording everything, because he intends to win. I am not a vengeful man by nature. I took no pleasure in gathering evidence against my own son's wife, and there were moments, listening back to those recordings alone at night, when the whole thing made me profoundly sad. Sad for Aaron. Sad for the family we might have been. Sad, even, in a strange way, for Sabrina, who had made herself into something so hard and so hollow that she could speak of discarding a husband the way another woman might speak of returning a dress. But sadness is not the same as weakness, and mercy toward a predator is only cruelty toward its next victim. I knew by then that if I let Sabrina succeed, she would strip my son of everything and move on to her next mark without a backward glance. Protecting the innocent sometimes requires you to be very cold toward the guilty. So I recorded every word, and I did not apologize to myself for it. Here is what none of them knew, what Sabrina, in all her cleverness, had never once thought to wonder. The trust that held our $72 million was not an ordinary trust. Marion had built it, and Marion had grown up watching greed tear her own family to pieces, watching aunts and uncles turn on one another over a grandfather's estate until nothing was left but bitterness and lawyers. Marion told me that story only a handful of times in 46 years, and always quietly, because the wound had never fully closed. Her grandfather had been a hard-working man who built a small fortune and left no clear instructions for it. And within 2 years of his death, the family he loved had torn itself to pieces, fighting over the pieces. Cousins who had grown up like siblings stopped speaking. Her own mother was cut out by a brother over a sum that seems small to me now. By the time the lawyers were finished, most of the money was gone to legal fees, and what remained had bought nothing but a lifetime of hatred among people who had once loved one another. Marion was a girl through all of it, watching the adults she trusted become strangers and enemies. And she decided even then that she would never let money do to her own family what it had done to her grandfather's. The character clause was that little girl's promise, kept 50 years later from beyond the grave. She swore our money would never do that to anyone we loved. So when we structured the trust, at her insistence, we included a single, unusual clause, one that my attorney had warned me was severe and that Marion had insisted upon anyway. She called it the character clause. I have come to think of it as her final act of protection, reaching out from beyond the grave to guard the family she was leaving behind. The clause was simple, and it was merciless. Any beneficiary or any spouse of a beneficiary who attempted to seize control of the trust through coercion, litigation, forged authority, or a claim that I was mentally unfit would be permanently and irrevocably removed. Not reduced, removed. And in that event, the entire trust would pass, in full, not to any family member, but to a charitable foundation Marion had named, dedicated to providing free medicine to people who could not afford it. Marion had looked at me across our kitchen table the night we signed it and said, "If our own blood ever comes for this money with a lawyer instead of a hug, then they have told us who they are, and the sick and the poor deserve it more than they do." I had thought at the time that we would never need it. I was wrong. Marion had insisted on that clause during one of the last good weeks of her life when we both knew the time we had left was short. I remember arguing with her about it, gently, telling her it felt harsh, that surely our own family would never need such a cruel safeguard. And I remember the way she looked at me, with that clear-eyed patience she brought to everything, and said, "Everett, I am not writing this clause because I distrust our family. I am writing it because I have watched what money does to families, and I love ours too much to leave them undefended against it." She had grown up as the poor cousin in a family torn apart by an inheritance, had watched people she loved become strangers over a will, and she had carried that wound her whole life. The character clause was her way of making sure it never happened to us. It was, I understand now, one of the wisest things she ever did. I remember the night we finished it. It was late, and Marion was tired in the way the illness made her tired, and we sat together at the kitchen table with the trust documents spread out between us, and she read the character clause aloud one final time in her steady voice. When she finished, she set the paper down and took my hand, and she said, "Everett, I hope with all my heart this is a wall no one in our family ever has to hit. But if someone does hit it, it will not be because the wall was cruel. It will be because they ran at it. Remember that when the time comes. Do not blame the wall." I told her she was being morbid, that our family would never need such a thing, and she smiled at me the way she always did when she knew something I did not yet know. And she said, "I hope you are right." Then we signed it, and we sealed it, and we never spoke of it again. She died a few weeks later, and 3 years after that, the wall did exactly what she built it to do. I did not tell Sabrina about the claws. Why would I? A trap only works if the animal does not see it. Instead, I let her keep pushing, let her lawyer keep sliding documents across my table, let her believe the old man was days away from signing everything over. And while she pushed, I quietly called the one person I trusted with all of it, my attorney and the trustee Marion and I had chosen years earlier, a careful and formidable woman named Diane Osei, who had helped us write the character clause and had kept its existence locked in her office ever since. I gave Diane the recordings. I gave her the documents Sabrina's lawyer had drafted, and I asked her a simple question. Had my daughter-in-law, in all her scheming, already done enough to trigger Marion's claws? Diane listened to the recordings twice. Then she told me that Sabrina had triggered it 3 separate times over. Diane Osei is not a warm woman, and I mean that as the highest compliment I can pay a person in her profession. She is precise and unhurried and utterly without sentiment when sentiment would cloud the truth. And she had been Marion's friend and our attorney for 30 years. When I brought her the recordings and the documents, she did not gasp or exclaim or tell me how sorry she was. She simply listened, twice, taking careful notes, and then she laid out the situation for me the way a surgeon lays out an operation, without a wasted word. She confirmed that the clause was valid and enforceable. She confirmed that it activated automatically without any need for my permission. And she confirmed that Sabrina, in her greed and her certainty and her contempt, had tripped it not once, but 3 separate times, each one documented, each one beyond dispute. Then Diane took off her glasses, and for just a moment the professional mask softened, and she said, "Marion always did think 3 moves ahead of the rest of us." She would be proud of how well the wall held. Diane explained it to me carefully, the way she explains everything, so that there could be no misunderstanding later. The character clause, she said, was not a matter of my opinion or my feelings. It was a legal condition written into the trust, and it activated automatically the moment its terms were met, whether I wished it to or not. Sabrina's demand that I sign over control had met those terms. Her lawyer's document, drafted to strip me of authority under the guise of protection, had met them again. And her recorded statements, in which she described coercing a man she believed to be mentally declining, had met them a 3rd time. And, most damningly of all, there was no discretion left for anyone to exercise. The clause had already fired. All that remained was to inform the people who had tripped it exactly what they had done, and to redirect the fortune, as Marion had always intended, to the ground where it truly belonged. I chose the moment carefully. I invited Aaron and Sabrina to my house one final time, telling them, in a defeated voice, that I was ready to sign. Sabrina arrived glowing, her lawyer beside her, the final version of the surrender document in his briefcase. She could barely hide her triumph as she laid the papers on my coffee table and offered me a pen. And that was when the door to my kitchen opened, and Diane Osei walked into my living room in a charcoal suit, carrying a slim folder, and sat down in the chair beside mine, and introduced herself as the trustee of the Lyle Family Trust. I watched the blood drain from Sabrina's face. She had spent weeks certain she was manipulating a helpless old man, and she was only now beginning to understand that the helpless old man had been interviewing her for a role she had already failed. Diane did not raise her voice. She never does. She simply opened her folder and explained, in clear and unhurried language, 3 things. First, that the trust Sabrina had been trying to seize was governed by a clause written years before Sabrina ever entered our lives. Second, that this clause permanently removed any person or spouse of any person who attempted to take control of the trust through coercion or false claims of my incapacity. And third, that Sabrina's own words, recorded across 4 visits and reviewed by counsel, constituted exactly such an attempt, several times over. "As of this moment," Diane said quietly, "neither you nor your husband are beneficiaries of this trust, and you never will be. You did not lose the money. You detonated it." I will never forget Sabrina's face in that moment. I have seen a great many people receive terrible news across a pharmacy counter, and I know the stages a face moves through. The disbelief, the bargaining, the dawning horror as the truth becomes undeniable. Sabrina moved through all of them in the space of about 10 seconds. First, she smiled, certain it was a bluff. Then she looked to her lawyer, waiting for him to object, to fix it, to earn his fee, and found him already closing his briefcase. Then she looked at the certified document Diane slid across the table, and I watched her read it, and I watched the exact instant she understood that it was real, that there was no argument to be made, no angle to be worked, that the fortune she had schemed and married and lied for had not merely slipped from her grasp, but had been destroyed, permanently, by her own hand, in front of witnesses. Her face went white, and then it went slack, and then something behind her eyes simply broke. She had run at Marion's wall as hard as a person can run, and the wall had not moved an inch. Sabrina's lawyer was already returning his papers to his briefcase, because a man like that can feel the ground giving way beneath a losing case. Sabrina turned on me then, and the mask came off entirely, and every ugly thing she had hidden behind that charming smile came pouring out. She called me names I will not repeat. She accused me of tricking her, of leading her on, as though I owed her the fortune she had married my son to steal. And through it all, I simply sat in my chair and let her rage, because there was nothing she could say that could touch me. When she finally ran out of venom, I spoke, for the first time all afternoon, in my own true voice, not the trembling one I had worn for weeks. "You came into my family with a lawyer instead of a heart," I told her. "My wife built a wall for exactly the kind of person you turned out to be. You did not run into that wall by accident. You spent a month running at it as hard as you could." And then there was Aaron. Through the entire confrontation, my son had sat silent on the sofa, shrinking smaller and smaller. And when Sabrina stormed out to wait in the car, he stayed behind, unable to look at me. I asked him, quietly, how much he had known, and to his small credit, he did not lie. He told me he had known some of it, that Sabrina had pushed, and he had told himself it was harmless, that he had been too weak and too eager to please her to stop it. He wept, and he asked me if he was removed from the trust too. And I told him the truth, that Marion's clause did not spare him, that his silence had cost him everything, and that this was the most important lesson his mother ever left him, delivered too late to be gentle. But I did not throw my son away, because a father's love is not a trust and does not disinherit. I told Aaron that he had lost the money and that the money was gone for good, but that he had not lost me. I told him that if he left the woman who had used him as a ladder, and if he spent the coming years learning, finally, to build a life with his own hands the way I had always wanted him to. Then he would find his father waiting, not with a check, but with a door that was open. Sabrina filed for divorce within 2 months, the instant it was certain there was no fortune left to extract, and she vanished from our lives as quickly as she had entered them, taking nothing, because there was nothing left for her to take. Aaron, for the first time in his life, was on his own. It was the best thing that ever happened to him. He took a job, a real one, the kind that leaves your hands tired at the end of the day. And for the first year, he was clumsy and resentful and called me too rarely. But something in him began, slowly, to change. The last time he came to dinner, he talked about his work with a quiet pride I had never heard in his voice before. The pride of a man who has finally earned something instead of being handed it. He did not mention the money once. And as I watched him across the same kitchen table where his mother once grew a fortune out of patience, I understood that Marion's claws had given my son the one inheritance that could actually save him. It had taken away the fortune that would have destroyed him and left him, at last, with the chance to become a man. The entire $72 million passed, exactly as Marion had written it, to the foundation she named. It funds free pharmacies now, in the kind of small towns where I spent my life, places where a grandmother should never have to choose between her heart medicine and her groceries. There are 4 of them open already, and Diane tells me that within 5 years there will be 20, spread across the counties where I once ran my stores, each one a small fortress against the particular cruelty of being sick and poor at the same time. Marion's name is on the door of the first one, in the town where we met, and I go there some mornings and stand behind the counter for an hour, counting pills, learning the names of the families, the way I did when I was a young man with nothing but a single store and a wife who believed in me. I have never felt richer than I do standing at that counter, giving away medicine, watching the relief on the face of someone who thought they would have to go without. There was a woman who came in during the first month, an older woman, thin and proud, who had been rationing her heart medication for 2 years, cutting the pills in half to make them last because the full dose cost more than she could spare. When the young pharmacist told her that here, in this place, her medicine was free, she did not understand at first. And then she did, and she had to sit down in the plastic chair by the window and cover her face with her hands. I watched that from across the room, and I thought about Sabrina and her leather briefcase and her lawyer, and about all the scheming and the coldness, and I thought, this is what she was fighting to take, this exact moment, this woman's relief. I have watched that same relief on 100 faces since the first free pharmacy opened its doors. A young father who could finally afford his daughter's inhaler, an old veteran who had been choosing between his blood pressure pills and his heating oil, a mother of 3 who wept at the counter because for the first time in years she did not have to decide which of her children's prescriptions she could afford to fill this month. Each of those moments cost a small piece of the fortune Sabrina tried to steal, and each of them is worth more than every dollar she ever schemed for. That is the thing the greedy can never understand, the thing that made them weak even at their most cunning. They believed the money was the prize. They never grasped that money is only ever a seed, and that its entire worth lies in what you choose to grow with it. Sabrina wanted to eat the seed. Marion planted it. And now, in small towns across 3 counties, it is growing into something that will outlive us all. And I felt no anger towards Sabrina anymore, only a vast and quiet gratitude that Marion had built a wall high enough to protect it. People ask me sometimes whether I regret it, whether I wish I had structured things so my son could have kept even a portion, whether the character clause was too harsh, whether I threw away a family fortune out of stubbornness. And my answer is always the same. The clause did not throw the fortune away. Greed did. Marion did not disinherit anyone. Sabrina disinherited herself the moment she chose a briefcase over a family. And my son disinherited himself the moment he chose silence over his own father. The money simply went where money should always go, to the people who need it rather than the people who scheme for it. And Aaron, stripped of the inheritance that would have destroyed him, is slowly becoming, at 38, the man I always hoped he would be. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson underneath it is as real as a life saved by the right medicine at the right time. For 40 years, I stood behind a counter and watched people reveal who they truly were in the moments they thought no one was paying attention. My daughter-in-law believed my gray hair and my old truck meant I was a target. She never understood that the quiet old man behind the counter is always the one paying the closest attention of all. Family is not a fortune you can seize with a lawyer. It is not a lock to be picked or a wall to be climbed. It is love and loyalty and character. And my wife built a fortune that could only be inherited by those who had them. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they built with their own hands. My name is Everett Lyle, and the fortune they schemed to steal, I gave to the sick and the poor, in the name of the woman who saw them coming.